Hello, and welcome back to the Caliphs, the rise and fall of Arab power. My name is Zaid Wahab, and today we're going to focus on military affairs during al-Muqtadir's decades-long reign. The Caliphate had all sorts of enemies along its borders, but its armed forces still managed to best their foes more often than not. At least that was the case before graft corroded its civil bureaucracy. The state's financial situation was left to deteriorate unchecked as top figures in the administration became more brazenly preoccupied with profiteering. The military only withstood this neglect because of its top man, a figure who united its efforts under his leadership. To better understand the challenges facing the armies, we'll follow the career of their head honcho in episode 84, General Mu'nis. I wonder if I should go ahead and abbreviate the show's subtitle to The Fall of Arab Power. Listeners, we are well into a decline from which there will be no rise. We spent our time tracing the tribulations of the court when we were last together, and it was a lot of names with hardly any historical significance. In that sense, our time today will be the exact opposite. We have the benefit of a single perspective and a whole lot of significant action. Ultimately, the military followed the same downward trend as the rest of the caliphate, but its collapse was more gradual. This was in large part thanks to the figure of Mu'nis, who served as a sort of supreme leader of the military for the entirety of the caliph's long reign. So far, I have referred to Mu'nis as a Turk, but he was actually a Byzantine eunuch. Not every source mentions this, and since he spent his entire career in the military and eventually came to lead the caliphate's armies by commanding the Turks, he was very much in the mold of a Bugha or Badr. It's in the company of the latter that Mu'nis first appears in our sources. He served in Badr's contingent when it was al-Mu'tadid's first command. This was in the 880s, and al-Mu'tadid was actually still just plain Ahmad back then, with his dad Talha leading the bulk of the troops. The would-be caliph had an epic bromance with Badr, whom he promptly put in charge of the caliphate's principal forces after he came to power. It seems that Badr was impressed by Mu'nis during those years, because over time he promoted him by giving him his own troops to lead. Mu'nis's close association with Badr turned from a golden ticket to a target on his back when Qasim became wazir in 901. Mu'nis was redeployed to Mecca that same year, so just before the wazir eliminated Badr in 902. Mu'nis remained in his remote posting until 908, when the ascension of the new Abbasid to the throne brought him back to Baghdad. We can find different rumors surrounding these moves. Some say he was exiled to Mecca for some chicanery in the capital, and others that he was recalled by al-Muqtadir because of a supposed close relationship Mu'nis had enjoyed with the caliph's father, al-Muqtadid. It's not easy to tell what's true and what isn't. All we know for sure is that Mu'nis was a hardened veteran and leader of a force accustomed to having a direct relationship with its sovereign. This bond was immediately consecrated in the crucible that was the coup against al-Muqtadir. Mu'nis championed the caliph throughout the whole thing, giving the young al-Muqtadir every reason to trust him completely. Mu'nis was honored at court as soon as the danger had passed and given control of as many forces as he could command. He wasn't the Ummah's only general, and we'll come across a couple other important figures who ordered forces of their own around. But from here on out, This is the Mu'nis Show. Mu'nis's first assignment was part of his reward. He was given the honor of leading the summer raid against the Byzantines. This was no longer the straightforward triumphal romp it was back in the day. The empire and the caliphate were now on roughly equal grounds in terms of military strength, and we hear of several prisoner exchanges between the two powers during this period. Their armies rarely met on open fields. Instead, we find reports of raids and sieges, meaning that military casualties were a lot lower than civilian ones. Mu'nis did a splendid job with his raid, but he soon received new orders. He was to head to Sistan to put down an attempt by the Saffarids to reassert control over their home province. On his way there, the general stopped by Jazira, or Mesopotamia, and asked its governor, Hussein ibn Hamdan, to join him on his campaign. This was the same Hussein ibn Hamdan who had killed the wazir and chased after the caliph only 1 year earlier, but it seems like that was all water under the bridge. Unlike pretty much everyone else involved in plotting and executing the failed coup, Hussein was forgiven for his part. Realistically speaking, the caliphate would have been hard-pressed to find someone else to govern Jazira. None other than the Hamdanids could stop the province from descending into chaos. Hussein helped Mu'nis in Sistan, and the two quashed the Safarid attempt with ease. Mu'nis was rewarded with the leadership of the summer raid once again, and Hussein was somewhat redeemed in the eyes of the court for his service. Things were relatively quiet for the next 3 years. The biggest piece of news is probably the agreement reached between Yusuf ibn Abbasid and Baghdad. Yusuf was officially recognized as governor of Azerbaijan in perpetuity by the new administration in return for an annual sum. Governor for perpetuity undersells it a little. The region west of the Caspian had essentially become Yusuf's fief. This lull in military activity lasted only until 913. That was the year the chief of the Qaramita, Abu Sa'id al-Jannabi, was murdered by one of his servants in Bahrain. His sons, 4 of them I think, led the group jointly for the next few years. They ambushed the Hajj caravan on its way back to Iraq in 914, killing thousands of men and taking hundreds of women alive. While not as bad as their earliest attack on the returning pilgrims, which claimed as many as 20,000 lives in 906, this despicable assault against an unarmed group of people completing a religious rite led to an uproar in Baghdad. Armies sent to punish the Qaramita didn't manage to catch very many. The handful of nomads they did capture were sent back to the capital, but an angry mob whipped itself into a frenzy and beat them to death while they were being escorted through the city. The Qaramita weren't the only threat that reared its head that year either. In fact, another Ismaili group began to menace the Abbasids as well. For the first time ever, our histories contain reports of Fatimid raids on Egypt. Just a quick refresher for anyone struggling to place this group. These were the bunch who followed the Ismaili Da'wah's leader after he proclaimed himself the descendant of Ismail back in 901. They fled Syria when the Caliphate turned its attention towards the region in 902, first to Palestine, then Egypt, then all the way west to Morocco, where one of their preachers had made great headway with a Berber tribe named the Qutama. The Qutama held a grudge against the Aghlabids, and they joined with the Ismailis against these rulers of the North African coast from Libya to Algeria. It only took the Fatimids a little over 5 years to completely dismantle the century-old dynasty. Their leader proclaimed himself caliph in early 910 in his new capital of Raqqada, near Qayrawan in Tunis, taking on the title Al-Mahdi Billah. We'll refer to him as the Fatimid Caliph to avoid confusion. But for the first time ever, the world had two caliphs, and they'll be joined by a third in just another couple decades. But back to our topic of the day. The Fatimids invaded Egypt twice during Al-Muqtadir's reign, first in 914, then again in 919. The first attack seems to have been more motivated by revenge than a serious attempt at conquest. Led by their caliph's son and heir, the Fatimids targeted officials and tribes that had chased, extorted, or otherwise harassed their leader on his perilous journey west a decade earlier. Their first target was Barqa, in eastern Libya today. Success there encouraged the Fatimids to push further, and they managed to take Alexandria from the unprepared Abbasids. The governor of Egypt called for aid, but by the time Mu'nis showed up at the head of a large army in 915, the Fatimids had taken the oasis of Fayyum, dangerously close to the capital of Fustat. Their attempt to cross the Nile was thwarted, and Mu'nis had an easy time pushing the overextended Fatimids back after that. They were so spooked by the appearance of Abbasid reinforcements that they abandoned Alexandria voluntarily, although it took an uprising to get them out of Barqa a few months later. Although he'd won a great victory, Mu'nis had no time to celebrate. While still on campaign in Egypt, he received orders from Baghdad to go deal with a new emergency. The Hamdanids were breaking away. It's unclear to me what prompted this. In fact, Hussein ibn Hamdan had led the summer raid against the Byzantines in 913, only to declare independence from the caliphate the very next year. My guess is that it had to do with money. Accounts obliquely allude to growing demands from the court, and it makes sense given that the financial strain the caliphate was under was only intensifying. Hussein ibn Hamdan used a coalition of 30,000 Kurds and Arabs to defeat an Abbasid army sent against him in 914. He failed to replicate this success when Mu'nis showed up the next year, and the general brought the Mesopotamian insurrection to an end by taking Hussein and his family into custody and forwarding them to Baghdad. There was to be still no rest for the weary, however. In 917, Yusuf ibn Abbasid, the governor of Azerbaijan, also rebelled against the Abbasids. Again, our sources don't include much in the way of explanation, so we must assume that this too was about the amount of revenue the court was asking for. Unlike the Hamdanids, Yusuf did manage to beat Mu'nis in 918, except he proceeded to lose to him in 919 and was taken captive on the battlefield. This was enough for the general to declare mission accomplished and return to Baghdad with his prisoner, despite the fact that Azerbaijan was still being governed by Ibn Abbasid's deputy. Invading the mountainous region would have required way more resources than Mu'nis had, and he's a good military tactician for recognizing his limits. Alas, once again, the general was sent to put out another fire as soon as he arrived to the caliph's court. While he was out dealing with Ibn Abbasid in Azerbaijan, the Fatimids had launched their second invasion of Egypt. They laid siege to Barqa for over a year and massacred its population in punishment when it fell. Many escaped and sought refuge in Alexandria, but that city surrendered to the Fatimid heir's army in 919. Although it submitted without a fight, the Fatimids punished its inhabitants for having switched back to the Abbasid side with more massacres. Perhaps if they'd pushed on to Fustat right after their conquest, they may have been able to succeed where they'd failed before. But their dilly-dallying gave the Abbasids enough time to deploy Mu'nis with reinforcements in early 920. Instead of going on the offensive, the general fortified the provincial capitals north and west, then reached out to the Fatimids with an offer from Baghdad. In return for acknowledging al-Muqtadir as the Ummah's true caliph and returning Barqa, Fayyum, and Alexandria, they could keep the rest of their conquests and essentially become the new Aghlabids. In fact, since they'd also conquered Morocco, the Fatimids would replace both the Aghlabids and the Idrisids. But let's not muddy the water further by bringing more dynasties into this discussion. The offer led to a stalemate of sorts. The Fatimid heir insisted on his father's right to rule the Ummah, but he didn't want to risk an all-out attack against the reinforced Fustat. He remained encamped in Fayyum with his armies for the next year, sending letters to Fustat, Mecca, and Medina, urging Muslims to rise up and overthrow the Abbasids. Although these efforts weren't entirely ineffectual, they didn't go far enough, and in 921, Mu'nis launched a well-coordinated attack on the heir's position. The campaign lasted from March to July, and it ended with a Fatimid withdrawal from Fayyum and Alexandria. They managed to hold on to Barqa this time around, and they used it to launch a couple attacks into Egypt, but no planned invasion of the province would be attempted for another 50 years. Mu'nis received a triumphal reception in Baghdad upon his return. He was bestowed a title by the caliph at court, al-Muzaffar, the victorious, and was given honorary dominion over Egypt and Syria. I say honorary because it's not like he could go administer them. His primary responsibility was still safeguarding the caliphate as its foremost general. I'm glad we finally have another lull in military activity, because it gives me a chance to thread in a couple relevant details. The government's finances were a mess by this point. In fact, Mu'nis nearly had a mutiny on his hands in Egypt because his troops were getting paid so inconsistently. Most jurisdictions were no longer forwarding taxes to Baghdad, a growing problem for the state. Al-Muqtadir hadn't made adequate investments in his military, and now the government lacked the resources to intimidate its provinces into compliance. Tax farming had also given way to the granting of all-out fiefs, which only further decentralized power away from Abbasid hands. For example, Yusuf ibn Abbasid was released from his captivity in 922 after he said he could guarantee 500,000 gold dinar if the caliph were to grant him Azerbaijan and Armenia. He wasn't merely reinstated as governor of these lands, but acknowledged as their ruler, with hereditary rights and all. This is probably the best point to note the divergent fates of the two commanders who betrayed al-Muqtadir. Yusuf was restored to power because the caliphate had little chance of dislodging his supporters from the near-impregnable mountains they still held. Hussein ibn Hamdan was not so lucky. His kin were pardoned and released, but he was put to death. Hamdanid power endured, however, as Hussein's brother Abdullah established a close working relationship with Mu'nis, and he became the next Abbasid governor of Mesopotamia. Today, two of Abdullah's sons are regarded as the founders of the Hamdanid dynasty proper, but we'll get to that later down the line. We're about a year or two past the midpoint of al-Muqtadir's long reign, and from here on out, we only hear about a single Abbasid adversary, the Qaramita. It's not like the Fatimids or Byzantines made peace with the caliphate or anything, but the rise of Abu Sa'id al-Jannabi's youngest son, Abu Tahir, as chief of the Qaramita in 923 made the group more savage and unrestrained than ever before. It is important to note, this was also the year of Ibn al-Furat's third and final tenure as wazir, the one that lived on in infamy and tarnished his reputation for good. He replaced Ibn al-Jarrah, who was paying the Qaramita an annual stipend to keep the peace, A couple accounts point to the termination of this arrangement as the reason which prompted the Bahrain-based group to renew their attacks on the Ummah. Since the two events took place only days apart, I don't think it's valid to pin the resurgence of the Qaramita on Ibn al-Furat's ascension. Okay, as you can tell, our brief respite from military action is over. The first assault by the Qaramita was on Basra in 923, led by Abu Tahir himself, the group's new 16-year-old chief. The Bedouins hadn't attacked a city in decades, so Basra was caught entirely by surprise when 1,700 Arab warriors suddenly appeared in the dead of night. They swiftly overwhelmed its paltry complement of defenders and proceeded to ravage the city for over 2 weeks that August. When scouts reported an incoming army, the Qaramita withdrew into the desert, taking Basra's wealth and women as loot to be sold in Bahraini markets. This is the point where one can start blaming Ibn al-Furat more credibly. The wazir was entirely consumed by his crusade of vengeance in Baghdad, and he paid absolutely no attention to the dangerous threat posed by the Qaramita. Instead, he asked the caliph to redeploy Mu'nis to Syria, where the general could focus on making sure tax revenue was collected. Mu'nis didn't argue against his new assignment. He was probably glad to put some distance between him and Ibn al-Furat, who was on a rampage of dispossessing and executing his political opponents. As the caliphate's decision-makers were distracted with these trivial affairs, the Qaramita were only emboldened by the absence of a military response. They didn't invade once again, however, but returned to their usual MO of attacking the Hajj caravans. Their assault on the pilgrims in 924 was especially embarrassing for the Abbasids because the Qaramita took members of the ruling clan and other court officials captive. This time al-Muqtadir opened negotiations, and unknown sums were sent to ensure the release of all 2,500 taken hostage that year. This was the crisis Ibn al-Furat's enemies used against him, and the wazir was deposed and executed a few short months later. Mu'nis was recalled from Syria, and the generals succeeded in capturing and punishing supporters of the Qaramita residing in Iraqi cities, but there wasn't much he could do against the mobile band of raiders after they had withdrawn. In 925, the Qaramita were so eager that they attacked the caravan while it was on its way to Mecca. Despite having an escort thousands strong, the troops could do little to protect the pilgrims against the Bedouins in the middle of the desert. They were forced to turn back to Iraq, and there was no Hajj for them that year. The only reason the pilgrimage went ahead in 926 was because the caliphate paid the Qaramita to stay away, and the Abbasids still sent thousands of troops to accompany the pilgrims, probably to take credit for their safety and boost morale a little. Feeling desperate, the court reached out to the recently reinstated governor of Armenia and Azerbaijan, Yusuf ibn Abbasid. In exchange for vanquishing the Qaramita, the wazir promised Yusuf an entire year's worth of tax revenue. Not only would he be able to keep the 500,000 he was meant to send to Baghdad, but Baghdad would actually forward all revenue it received from the east that year to him. This offer was too good for Yusuf to turn down. In 927, he led his forces to Iraq and set up shop in Wasit. His troops were a mix of Ushrusaniya, Turkish mercenaries from the east, and Daylamites. In other words, these were foreigners who had absolutely no connection to the caliphate or its people, and they abused the local population while they waited for the Qaramita to strike. There was a lot going on that year. A Byzantine invasion drew Mu'nis to Armenia, and the rapid change of wazirs at court led to mixed signals from Baghdad. We'll cover this year more closely next time. For now, let's stick with Yusuf ibn Abbasid. He was lulled into complacency by the overwhelming numerical advantage he enjoyed over his foes, and is said to have spent time wording a letter telling the caliph of his glorious victory while the Qaramita were surreptitiously preparing to attack. There were between 2,000 and 3,000 of them, while Yusuf had over 8,000 men. The battle lasted all day, as the Qaramita used their mobility to attack and retreat repeatedly. After Yusuf's formation had been messed up by all their maneuvers, the chief of the Qaramita, Abu Tahir, led a small force in person, surrounded the deluded Yusuf, and took him prisoner. A rude awakening if there ever was one. The caliph's court was stunned when news of this fiasco reached Baghdad, and terror spread like wildfire throughout the land. The Qaramita will menace Iraq for the next few years, with dire consequences for this Abbasid administration. We have a little more time together, but instead of progressing the narrative, I'd like to use it to reflect on a couple important details that may have been lost in today's fast-paced action. I didn't make a big deal about Mu'nis's background, but it's a topic that deserves further analysis. This isn't the first time our sources tell of a Byzantine eunuch commanding the caliphate's armies, but it is the first time the Turks were led by someone from outside their ethnic group. Let's start with the fact that Mu'nis was a eunuch. Eunuchs were introduced to the caliphate at the dawn of the dynastic age. The Umayyads got their first eunuchs from the Byzantines. There's a short account about the first post-Rashidun caliph, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, telling his wife that she didn't need to wear her veil in front of the eunuchs he'd hired to serve her harem, only for her to shut him down by saying that modesty is about the self and not the other. That's what eunuchs were to the Arabs. Men you could trust around your most prized possessions, your wives. We mainly find them as status markers for the rich and powerful, to whom they often became close confidants. It's not much of a leap to go from trusting someone with your harem to trusting them with your riches, secrets, and innermost thoughts. This must be how Mu'nis rose from eunuch to commander. It's unclear to me whether he was a trusted attendant to al-Mu'tadid or his general Badr, though most accounts claim it was the latter. Assuming it was Badr, it's not hard to see how a close relationship with the general would have led him to favor Mu'nis and promote him to commander. Mu'nis wasn't the only foreigner leading a Abbasid army at this point in time. The military governor of Egypt was Duq al-Rumi, or Doug the Roman, and the commander of the Ummah's forces at Tarsus was Thamal al-Dulafi, a servant who had worked for the Dulafids in his youth. But if it was such a straightforward transition, how come we've never had foreigners command the Turks before? Well, to understand that, we need to turn our attention to a subject we glossed over entirely: the abandonment of Samarra. The Abbasid court at Samarra marked the apogee of the caliphate's Turkish phase. During the reigns of Al-Mu'tasim, Al-Wathiq, and Al-Mutawakkil, the state imported Turks from the east and trained them in its capital as a military caste. We've already discussed the anarchy that brought about an end to this model at length, but we haven't fully considered the consequences of moving the court back to Baghdad. The Abbasid armies performed admirably under Al-Mu'tamid and Al-Mu'tadid because they were led by Abbasids who worked closely with the Turkish leadership. Al-Muqtafi's hands-off approach let the civil bureaucracy come between the caliph and his military, and we heard how Qasim installed a secretary in charge of the army commanders as a liaison with the court after his assassination of Badr. The rise of Mu'nis somewhat restored the balance between the civil and military bureaucracies, at least in regards to proximity to the caliph. However, since the state was no longer actively recruiting Turks to replenish its rank and file, the problem of finding the next generation of military leaders remained unresolved. It wasn't a matter of identifying good candidates for command. Without Samarra, the troops had no opportunity to build a relationship with the caliph's court, and worse still, no reason to remain loyal to the caliph himself. Their only material link to the Abbasids were their salaries, which became less and less regular as financial mismanagement hollowed out the treasury. It was a real stroke of luck that the coup at the outset of his reign brought al-Muqtadir and Mu'nis together. As both of al-Mu'tadid's sons and successors proved completely uninterested in taking charge of the administration of their caliphate, the Turks could have very well been left with absolutely no tether to the state. Mu'nis may not have been one of them ethnically speaking, but his closeness to Badr and now the caliph meant he alone could represent them at court as their leader. He served in this capacity for most of al-Muqtadir's long reign. But this special relationship was strained and ultimately destroyed. Next time, we'll connect all we've learned about this caliph's reign to see what that collapse looked like and what it spelled for the Abbasids. Here on The Caliphs, the rise and fall of Arab power.